Suffering from earbud-related discomfort and low-quality audio? Try the new Galaxy Buds 3 from Samsung. Now you can listen in comfort throughout your day with a redesigned fit and start hearing all your favorite sounds crystal clear, from your morning workout playlist to your evening podcast. Possible side effects include smiles, happiness, better concentration, and more energy during workouts. Some listeners also experience closer relationships with loved ones due to improved call quality. Visit Samsung.com or ask your local retailer if Galaxy Buds 3 are right for you.
Brazen.
Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Tom Wright, and this week I'm speaking to Tess Davis about the murky world of cultural racketeering. A lawyer and archaeologist by training, Tess is the executive director at the Antiquities Coalition, where she leads work to tackle the illicit trafficking of antiquities and ancient art. So Tess, thanks for joining us.
Yes, no, thank you for the invitation.
Well, before we get into what I think is an astounding subject, which is the subject of the use of the art world to launder dirty money, and there's so many different ways we can go with that subject, I think we should just remind the audience that you have appeared in a Project Brazen podcast, last year's Dynamite Doug, which, just to remind people who haven't listened to it or maybe have forgotten, it's about one of the craziest art dealers of all time, Douglas Latchford, who basically emptied a whole country of its treasures, the country being Cambodia. And Tess, you played a pivotal role in the uncovering of that scandal. So why don't you just tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yes, this was, first of all, thank you again for using your platform to raise awareness of this case. It's hugely important, and it's also still very relevant today because the crimes that Latchford and his associates did, starting 50 years ago, those are things we're seeing repeated today in places like Ukraine, and Sudan, and Ethiopia. We get reports across our desk every day of an illicit trade in these blood antiquities that are headed to the U.S. market. But even in this unfortunately crowded field of villains who have committed these crimes over time, Douglas Latchford stands out. I think I'm very comfortable saying he was a one-man supply and demand of blood antiquities from the Cambodian genocide and the chaos that preceded and followed it. And again, to stress, it can't be stressed too much. These pieces were headed to the West, particularly to the United States and our art market.
Well, we should say that, the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia in the 70s, and there was a reign of terror there. For younger listeners who might not know the whole story, and 2 million Cambodians died, maybe a quarter of the population. Many children were gooned into being child soldiers. And through this guy, Douglas Latchford, a British guy living in Bangkok, then a younger man, started to sort of collude with the Khmer Rouge to get statues out of the country, which then found their way into the Western art market, including into the Met Museum in New York, and many other museums. He ended up getting indicted in 2019 and died the next year. So just talk about your own role. You're being modest, but talk about your own role in how you helped piece together the crime and what that entailed.
Well, Latchford is what my colleague Simon McKenzie referred to as a Janus figure, the Roman god who had two faces. So with one hand, he'd be working with, the very worst of humanity. I mean, we're talking Khmer Rouge, responsible for one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. And with the other hand, dealing with the very heights of the art market, the Met, the Norden Simon Museum, pretty much name a major museum with a major Cambodian collection, and they dealt with him, the author of these glossy coffee table books. And there's few people who can serve that role, who can deal with, again, with one hand, with the looters of these blood antiquities, and with the other of the height of the market. And that's why he was so effective. And it's very unfortunate he never did face justice in a court of law, but at least the truth is out about his legacy. And, it's going to take many more years, I think, to piece together the full scale of these crimes. It's definitely a work in progress. And this isn't unusual. I mean, we're still dealing with the aftermath of the Nazi looting of art during the Holocaust. These things that happen quite quickly take years, decades, even centuries to unravel. But he was hiding in plain sight for so long. And thankfully, it was hubris, as is so often the case, that ended up exposing him and exposing many of those he worked with. About 12 years ago now, a statue came up for sale at Sotheby's auction house in New York, the feet of which were still in situ at this 10th century ancient capital of Cambodia in the midst of the Cambodian jungle, this side of Kokare. And this was pieced together that, this was the same piece. And Cambodia strongly came out against the auction house, demanding that they return it. Clearly this is stolen property. And that set off a domino effect that exposed the dealings not only of the auction house, but eventually Latchford's role in this, again, as this one-man supply and demand. And I do encourage your listeners, if they haven't, to listen to the podcast. It's an important story for history. It's a very relevant story today. Again, these are crimes that are still very much happening in different areas of armed conflict and crisis around the world.
Well, I mean, Latchford was donating statues to the Met Museum, many statues there along Fifth Avenue in a wing that was opened not that long ago, donated by him. And he was close friends with a curator there, a guy called Martin Lerner. He was close with lots of art houses that are on Fifth Avenue there and also in London. He was very wealthy. He had a chauffeured Rolls Royce in London, beautiful houses around the world. Then, as you said, the statue was found. The statue that came up for auction at Sotheby's, the feet of that statue were still in situ in the jungle of Cambodia. And Douglas Latchford and many people in your world, they always argue, well, I don't know where this piece came from. And this isn't just statues from the Cambodian jungle. This is modern art, whatever it is. Sotheby's, Christie's. I mean, Christie's in the $1 billion whale case, Joe Low was selling all this art that was stolen. And they would just say, well, we don't know who the seller is. It's some shell company. So Douglas Latchford, obviously indicted in 2019, died the next year. This has been going on, but things are changing, right? The world is becoming, and the work you do at the Antiquities Coalition, an NGO that works day in, day out on this issue, is trying to stop the use of art as a way to channel dirty money. But it's a difficult job. It's very difficult. And it's still one of the, we cover on whale hunting all these kinds of places where dirty money flows, be it the banking industry or jewelry, gold. But the art market is still one of the last places to reform, isn't it? And your job's pretty difficult.
It is, and it's something that, we work in this area hoping that our work will no longer be needed. But our organization is a nonprofit called the Antiquities Coalition, and we're dedicated to combating the illicit trade in ancient art while promoting responsible cultural exchange. And so our organization is composed of business leaders, former government officials, archaeologists, lawyers, and others, basically, who are all committed to the same goal of cultural preservation. And a key tenet of our work is that for too long, and this continues today, public policy has treated art and antiquities crime as a white-collar and victimless crime. And that's if it's treated them as crimes at all. And obviously the story of Douglas Latchford, for those who listen to the podcast, I think illustrates quite well how this is not true. There are many victims to these crimes, but since our organization was founded, we really worked to correct this false narrative, to stress that cultural heritage has been looted and stolen by a who's who of rogue states, armed insurgencies, mafias, terrorist organizations. And this includes, in decades past, everyone from the Nazis to the Khmer Rouge, IRA, active art thieves, and more recently Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS or Daesh, the Houthis. But as you mentioned, in recent years, a series of these smoking guns has also exposed how bad actors are misusing the art market to launder money, to evade sanctions, and hide their ill-gotten gains. And American calls for action are being echoed now by a wide range of international partners. We're seeing this issue being taken up by such varied groups as the UN Security Council, the G20, the European Union, and increasingly NATO. But despite this progress, it unfortunately continues to be treated by some as, a matter of archaeology, a matter of conservation or preservation. And I say this as a trained archaeologist who has worked in preservation for decades now, but these crimes are a failure of governance, law, diplomacy, civil society, and markets, all the failures, many failures. But this isn't something that's going to be solved by better archaeology. We have to strengthen law enforcement, we have to strengthen international cooperation, and we have to strengthen economic integrity. All heavy lifts, unfortunately.
So the naysayers will say that, as you mentioned, white-collar crime here, no real victim, just some statues going missing. What you're saying is that in a country where statues go missing, like Syria during ISIS, for example, when Palmyra was overrun by terrorists and everything got smashed and taken out and sold off, that is a symptom of a country that doesn't have the rule of law. And often the sale of those antiquities is creating a pot of money that those bad actors can use for other things. So back in the Douglas Latchford era, the 1970s in Cambodia, that was the Khmer Rouge. And then, that's indirectly funded by the museums and the collectors in the West who buy this stuff. Now, people say, well, this is a historical problem. This is the Khmer Rouge in the 70s. This was the Elgin marbles in the 1700s, 1800s in Britain in the British Museum. But just last year, Nazim Ahmad, a Lebanese art collector, was indicted by the US for using art to launder Hezbollah money, right? So that's an example of something that you're talking about.
The way the market is, it can be very easily abused. And so what we're seeing is people with criminal tendencies, this is really the last remaining front to abuse and manipulate, especially with, post 9/11 reforms that closed off some of these other major markets. Our art, remains the holdout. And it's becoming increasingly well documented that, art provides a lucrative and often untraceable funding source for bad guys, be they, Putin's cronies, be they Douglas Latchford, be they Hezbollah operatives. If you're looking at this from a very mercenary view, it's a very easy market to take advantage of. And part of this is money. I mean, art, of course, is an industry now. It has been increasingly for decades and even in recent centuries. But particularly since the 1970s, we've seen the value of art go up exponentially, that it's, now a financial resource just like any other. And, this multi-billion-dollar scale of the art market, that in itself makes art vulnerable to a wide range of crime. But it's important to stress that in addition to the high dollar value figures that we're talking about, other aspects of the art market contribute. And this includes its longstanding culture of what I think the market would refer to as discretion and what some others may call outright secrecy, as well as the unique nature of art itself. I mean, think about a painting. How many valuable objects like that could be looked at by two different equally qualified experts who would walk away with different valuations, sometimes millions, tens of millions of dollars apart from one another. And that in turn may be tens of millions, sometimes even hundreds of millions, different from what someone's willing to pay for when it comes up at auction. There's not a lot of objects that have that wide fluctuation in price. So that makes the art market very susceptible to these crimes as well. Now, one would hope that these aspects of the art market would make it subject to more regulation, not less. But instead, the opposite's happened. And it's hard to know exactly why that is. But I think one reason is to come back to this point that I think it's, this is seen as a victimless crime. That art is seen as the purview of the wealthy, as something that doesn't affect anyone beyond the wealthy. That if art crime is viewed as a crime at all, again, it's this white-collar, victimless one. So you take these things together, the amount of money involved, multi-billion-dollar market, it's a perfect storm for a wide range of crimes, from fraud to forgery, tax evasion, money laundering, sanctions evasion, and terrorist financing.
Well, let's talk about terrorist financing. So Nazim Ahmad was indicted. He was put on a blacklist, I think 3 years ago, for his involvement with financing Hezbollah, which is, of course, the Lebanon-based Iran-financed terrorism group by the U.S. administration. And then last year, he was indicted for avoiding those sanctions by using the art market. And he moved a staggering amount of money illegally into the American financial system using art, $160 million. So that gets to what you were saying. Basically, you can make up art valuation. So you can say, I buy this painting for X amount, 10 million, you sell it for 100 million. That's 90 million of black money you can move if you use shell companies so nobody knows your name. And he was selling into galleries in New York. He was selling into galleries in Chicago. Those people were claiming in the New York Times they had no idea that this guy, Nazim Ahmed, a sanctioned terrorist financier, is involved because his name's not the name on the purchase. Now, it all strikes me as nonsense because you should know who you're buying and selling from if you're a business. Banks have to do that. A bank cannot these days say, well, we open an account for this person, they turn out to be a terrorist. So many banks get fined under the Bank Secrecy Act for that, right? But the art world, as you said, is lagging so far behind. Europe has tried to change this, right? They've brought in laws that the buyers and sellers, the Christie's, the Sotheby's, they have to know the identity of the sellers. They have to know the source of their wealth, but not the US. That's my understanding. So, you're saying it's because perhaps people think there's no crime there, but nowadays it seems like, the US government thinks there is. Terrorist financing is happening. Russians too, people who have been behind Putin's invasion of Ukraine, of the Rottenberg brothers, who are famous for being judo partners with Putin, were also involved in huge amounts of art trafficked in and out of the US. So it's very strange it's not a bigger issue.
It is, and I think that's starting to change, but it's certainly not changing quick enough. Law enforcement and governments, we're always behind the criminals. They're always adapting faster than we are. But the Rothenberg case reads like a John le Carré novel or something. And basically, just to summarize that, in 2020, the U.S. Senate released the results of this 2-year bipartisan investigation from a group called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, the PSI, compiled from dozens of interviews, literally millions of documents that detailed how a pair of Russian oligarchs had laundered at least, and this is just, tip of the iceberg, 18 million. And we're not talking about through, back alley shops, but top auction houses and galleries and full evasion of U.S. sanctions that were proposed in 2014 on Vladimir Putin's inner circle, the last time, they invaded Ukraine. And basically what had happened was these two U.S. senators, Senators Rob Portman and Tom Carper, they spearheaded this inquiry in the hope of discovering why these sanctions, which again had been put in place with the invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, had not been more effective. So they weren't expecting to find art here. They were just trying to find out, why aren't these sanctions working? Everyone seems to be operating as normal, even though we've hit them with every tool that we have. And their answer, one of the answers was, this art market's continuing exemption from laws and regulations that now literally protect every industry of comparable risk and scale. At the heart of the story are these two Russian billionaires, Arkady and Boris Rodenberg, who over the years amassed a fortune in contracts and investments tied to the Kremlin due to their childhood friendship with Putin. So have you seen these photographs of Putin playing judo, which circulate quite widely on the internet? The Rodenbergs are usually in those photos with them. Again, childhood best friends, judo club, etc. And again, have made so much money. The bridge to Crimea, that plays such a prominent role in the conflict today, Rodenberg contract. Infrastructure for the Sochi Olympics, Rodenberg contract. So by the time this report was published, and again, this was 2020, so before this latest round of the conflict, sanctions had targeted over 700 Russian individuals and entities. And not only had Russia not withdrawn from the contested territory, it expanded its military presence. And of course, as we've seen, that, expansion has continued. And this led the senators I mentioned, to suspect that blacklisted individuals and entities were finding some other way to access the U.S. economy. And so they launched this investigation to find out whether and how. And the answer was a resounding yes, due to these regulatory loopholes. Now, some of these loopholes are beyond the scope of this episode, like dealing with how our Treasury Department collects beneficial ownership information, how it implements and announces sanctions, and like the threshold for blocking companies that are owned by sanctions individuals. But the major takeaway from the report, the major focus of this 150-page report, was that the art market's continuing exemption from, again, what are standard laws and regulations. I mean, they apply to literally every other industry that's comparable. It gave these billionaire brothers this backdoor into the United States, and with it, the world's largest economy.
Right. So they were using New York auction houses to buy art, but nobody really knew that Arcadian Boris Rodenberg was behind it. That's the simple way of putting it, right? It was just they used front companies, and they were able to buy into the market and move money and sell and buy. So move money.
Yes, no, exactly. And, the Rodenberg scheme, it hinged on this concept of beneficial ownership. And this is confusing in this case because it's both the beneficial ownership of the corporations, the shell companies they were using, but also the beneficial ownership of the art involved. And again, they use shell companies and they use these intermediaries. And of course, shell companies are, it's important to stress, they're not necessarily illegal, but they can certainly be useful tools for illegal acts. And they, one thing that astounded me about this investigation was how difficult it is even for U.S. law enforcement, with U.S. investigators, with the full weight of Congress behind them and the Department of Homeland Security and all of these agencies, how difficult it is even for them to determine who funds and profits from shell companies. It floored me that, our law enforcement is, having to refer in some cases to leaks like the Pandora Papers or the Panama Papers to find out these things. That's a problem. And, this report, as damning as it was, it stresses repeatedly, they don't think they found all of them. I mean, they were operating from leaks, just like the rest of us. But how it worked in this case, the Rodenberg brothers used an intermediary. In this case, it was an American expat from Moscow by the name of Gregory Boutzer. And again, this is a common practice, not necessarily illegal. There are valid reasons, a wealthy person may not want the public to know what valuable paintings and whatnot they have. There's the risk of theft, etc. But Boutzer or his art agency, what they would do was bid on works for the Rodenbergs at auction or negotiate with private dealers. And then he would purchase the pieces using Rodenberg money, but disguised through the shell companies, and then transfer the title to the Rodenbergs or one of the corporations they controlled. And so from May to November 2014, again, we're talking about the earlier phase of the Ukraine conflict, these shell companies were used to purchase at least $18 million plus worth of art in the U.S. You mentioned the Bank Secrecy Act. That's our main, poorly named, I think, anti-money laundering law. But in short, it requires high-risk individuals and institutions to assist our U.S. federal government in detecting and preventing financial crimes. But, major auction houses don't have to comply. If Boutzer, this intermediary, had been buying precious metals, stones or jewels, or, even an automobile, a boat, or a plane, U.S. law would have required the sellers to confirm the identity of the actual buyer and taken these basic steps to ensure the transactions weren't covered. And as you mentioned, the European Union, the UK, even Switzerland have all already applied their AML regimes to the art market, but the U.S. has yet to, and that's a big gap.
When Switzerland's ahead of you with anti-money laundering, you know that you're lagging the pack big time. So that's what I'd say about that.
Problem.
But I understand. I think everyone can understand why auction houses. I don't want to single out the big ones like Sotheby's and Christie's, but the small galleries as well. Everybody they have limited interest in wanting to ask too many questions. I mean, they'll obviously not do illegal things. They'll stick to whatever is the letter of the law in whatever jurisdiction they're in, but they don't want to be having to find out who's 3 layers back in a transaction, and it's going to slow down their deal flow and they're going to make a lot less money. So what about the museums that a lot of this stuff ends up in? We'll go back to Antiquities and we'll go back to the Met Museum. There's been a huge reckoning in the last few years with these Western museums that are full of this stolen stuff. I think there's podcasts called Stuff the British Stole or, things like that. It goes back to colonial times in many cases from India or the Middle East or wherever. Go back to the Douglas Latchford case where a lot of this stuff was stolen from Cambodia. It's not just money laundering. It's also the fact that these countries, these are their cultural artifacts. They want them back. In Cambodia's case, these things are seen as spiritual statues that people like to pray to in the temples they were stolen from, blown up from. These guys blew up the statues from their plinths. But the Met has had to give back a bunch of these Latchford statues and many other items to Italy and other places, Greece. And they've set up a task force that's supposed to be giving advice on how to give back many, many thousands of statues in the Met that are potentially stolen. But then they put this woman, Shelby White, onto the task force. Tell me why putting Shelby White, who Shelby White is, and why putting her onto the task force was a pretty strange move, to say the least.
So Shelby White is a very prominent figure in the American art world, actually in the international art world. She and her now deceased husband have donated, tens of millions of dollars to the Met, countless antiquities, and amassed one of the most impressive collections, private collections themselves in their home. And over recent, decades, since the 90s, there has been a solid drumbeat of problems revealed with this collection. In 1993, she returned 16 Roman artifacts following a lawsuit. In 2008, another 10 following Italian demands. And she was most recently the subject of a very dedicated investigation from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And I think it's important to stress that following this investigation, White claimed to have no knowledge of the object's illicit origins, but dozens and dozens and dozens, I believe over 71 looted and stolen objects were seized from her private collection from places like Yemen, Turkey, and Italy. And then another additional 17 were seized from the Met that she had been donated. So a problematic history with this issue.
This is the person that the Met chooses to put on a 12-person task force that's supposed to be dealing with the fact that the Met is full of thousands, if not more, statues which are stolen from all over the world. I mean, that's a crazy thing to me.
It is. And I mean, we're hoping, or we're still seeing, so in spring of 2023, the Met, after much public pressure in recent years, announced these new initiatives related to cultural property and collecting. They've promised a focused review of works in the collection, hiring additional provenance researchers to join, further engaging with their staff and trustees, including White in this case, and also using their platform to support and, contribute to raising awareness of the problem. So this is still a very new initiative. We're welcoming these statements from the Met of these new policies and practices, and we hope they follow through on them because, again, their leadership on this issue is hugely important. You're not going to see better standards at an institution like Sotheby's or Christie's than you see from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's really their responsibility, their obligation to set the standard for the art market. You're not going to see better behavior from the private sector than you see from public institutions like museums. And so their action on this is crucial. It still remains to be seen what will happen. They have an opportunity here to set a gold standard, to learn from past mistakes. I hope they do it.
Yeah, and as you said, they have been starting to return statues. There's some of these Douglas Latchford statues that we started this great conversation talking about. They have gone back to Cambodia. They're now back in Cambodia. Others, though, statues that are mentioned in Latchford's 2019 indictment are still sitting there in the gallery in the Met. And it's crazy to me that the wheels of justice in this case turn so slowly. But Tess, thanks for joining us. It's been a wonderful conversation. And congratulations for all the great work you do at the Antiquities Coalition, and keep it up.
Oh, well, thank you so much, and we appreciate your interest in the topic. So thank you for using your platform to raise awareness of this.
Yes, and of course, you can go back to the Dynamite Doug podcast on all the Brazen networks. That's it for this week, and thanks to Tess for joining us. You can find out more about the Antiquities Coalition at their website, antiquities.coalition.org. And for more from whale hunting, subscribe to our newsletter at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Binaikia. For Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Brian Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.
The vampire squid has 8 arms connected by a webbed cloak.
When not lit by sun and water, the caves are eerie, still.
While solar rainbows spark delight, lunar rainbows inspire awe.
I'm Lena Kaufman.
And I'm Leo Richards. We're your hosts.
And for 5 minutes each week, we'll be sharing a natural wonder with you.
5 minutes to stop and breathe. From Brazen, this is Wonder. Available now wherever you get your podcasts.